If you want to take your seat, we're going to start shortly. So dear colleagues, dear friends, in the room and online, this first session is being live streamed. On behalf of our 110 members spread across 20 countries at Finance Watch, a warm welcome to the first Finance for Society Forum, which will be held every 2 years. So we'll alternate with more traditional policy events, which will then take place next year, and in 27 we'll have again a Finance for Society Forum. Now, at a more traditional conference, speakers push their expertise to the crowd. Organizers usually convey technical policy positions. At a forum, the forum is more of a meeting where participants discuss an issue of public interest and how to address it. So I very much hope you're all participants in the room, and this is more like a big workshop, right? So don't be a passive audience, please. I think it's great news in itself. We had more than 200 registrations to discuss the future of the financial system, because I think, whether we like it or not, it's still at the root of many of the problems humanity and society are facing today. And as our first keynote will explain in a minute, finance ultimately creates and controls the future we will live in. Now, this is a very special crowd of diverse civil society actors, academics, think tanks, NGOs, consumer associations, trade unions, philanthropy. And I really think that the collective knowledge, so the brains, but also the convictions you have, the hearts present in the room, represents an amazing potential for change. And I'd like all of you to spend the day defining what a financial system serving society looks like, and also how we get there. So I'd like you to spend the day plotting how we will start winning. We all know that we live in a world of great dangers. They will be discussed throughout the day. In my view, the most pressing one is the rapid growth of a global movement of fear and hate, which is controlled and funded by the very oligarchs who own and designed this current system. So I think the challenge for us is to build a counter-movement of hope and solidarity to change this system. Now, I think to do so, civil society needs to address three gaps in the way we have functioned the last 25 years. A lack of a vision and strategy, a lack of collaboration, which is how do we put our collective capacities and resources at the service of that collective strategy, and then a mobilization capacity. So vision, collaboration, mobilization, and that's how we grow the movement to start winning. And in my view, we start today, and we will continue together. Now, to set the scene for discussion, I have the great pleasure to introduce Geoff Mann, who's a professor of geography at Simon Fraser University. He's also the director of the Center for Global Political Economy, and the author, among others, of Climate Leviathan, Towards a Political Theory of a Planetary Future. His writing and research focuses on uncertainty and crisis in today's societies and the ways the state responds to address political, economic, and ecological crises. Geoff will deploy his thinking for about 20 minutes, which will leave us ample time for what I hope will be an active exchange with you in the room and also online. Have a great day. Geoff.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me today. I feel very fortunate to be here. It was a very long trip, and I think I'm recovered. So I came from Vancouver, British Columbia, and I was unaware, I promise I was unaware that this shirt would signal I was the sole Canadian in the room, but here we are. So anyway, thank you very much for having me. And as Benoit mentioned, my goal today is to speak quite briefly, at least by academic standards, about the relationship between what finance perhaps could be and global uncertainties at the moment. Thanks very much. So a century ago, the economist Frank Knight, who many of you may be familiar with, proposed a distinction between risk and uncertainty that has since become the discipline of economics common sense. Risk, he said, is probabilistic, knowable, and measurable. It is, if you will, an objective feature of the world, a fact upon which we can base judgments. If there's a 50% chance of rain tomorrow, there is a 50% chance of rain tomorrow. Should you bring your raincoat? Your answer does not depend on whether or not you think 50% means 50%, but on what you choose to do with that information. But uncertainty, according to Knight, is something different. It describes a situation in which the likelihood of future possibilities is not measurable. We might have an intuition about what the future holds, but cannot assign meaningful probabilities to this or that outcome. Our only guide is what he called our opinions, however well or ill-informed. Now, this has become to be known as Knightian uncertainty, an awkward adjective. And it is often equated with what I think colloquially we might call radical uncertainty. But this is inaccurate. Knight's uncertainty is not the fundamental uncertainty many of us feel today in a world of polycrisis. Knight's uncertainty is about the undulations of a well-knit institutional and political economic fabric, the realm of productive activity in a modern capitalist economy. And his point, the whole point of his book, which was written 100 years ago, was to show how uncertainty explains why, in a system of what he called free enterprise, competition does not eliminate the opportunity for profit. Profit, Knight said, was the reward of what he called a special social class, the businessmen, who, unlike the rest of us, specialize in superior judgment, deciding what to do and how to do it. They shape the future for the rest of us. Now, to Knight's great dismay, a few years later, his bête noire, John Maynard Keynes, also made uncertainty central economic thought, but in a manner much closer, I think, to what many of us think about when we think of radical uncertainty. And as Keynes put it in 1937, and I apologize, it's a bit of a long quote, but it's quite a good one. By uncertain knowledge, when I say I here, I'm pretending to be Keynes, but which I won't actually do because that would be quite embarrassing. By uncertain knowledge, I do not mean to distinguish between what is known and what is only probable. The game of roulette is not subject in this sense to uncertainty, nor is the prospect of a victory bond being drawn. Or again, the expectation of life is only slightly uncertain. Even the weather is only moderately uncertain. The sense in which I am using the term is that in which the prospect of a European war is uncertain, or the price of copper and the rate of interest 20 years hence, or the obsolescence of a new invention, or the position of private wealth holders in the social system in 1970. About these matters, there is no scientific basis on which to form any calculable probability, whatever. We simply do not know. This is the kind of uncertainty I think most important today, and Keynes' mention of the weather raises the kinds of questions that I have been worrying about, just the kinds of questions that I've been worrying about over the last several years, probably like many of you. Now, Keynes begins in this quote above, or earlier, with an intuition about the calculability that is drawn from Knight. And on those terms, he says, weather goes in the moderately uncertain box, which for him means it is closer to probable than it is to something we simply do not know about. Here we have to think of probable, however, as he meant it, which is not that it might happen, but rather that it is probable we can develop probabilities about it. And it's true that even with the much greater extremes relative to 1937, the weather today is very probable in this sense. In fact, modern meteorology makes it more than moderately uncertain, but only if we are talking about tomorrow or maybe a week from now. If we are talking about the weather a year from now or 10 years from now, it is nowhere near as probable as it was in 1937. It is far more than moderately uncertain, and that's because the background conditions, in this case what we call climate, are no longer dependably similar to the past. So, for example, imagine one morning in 1937, you are hanging out with John Maynard Keynes, and you tell him that the newspaper says that there is a 0% chance of rain in the Arctic tomorrow. I think he would have laughed at your forecast. He would have said something like, of course it doesn't rain in the Arctic in the winter. That's what makes it the Arctic. But if you were both transported through time and to this past winter, and you mentioned to a friend that there was a 0% chance of rain in the Arctic, well, that is no longer absurd, and you both might have heaved a sigh of relief. It would have seemed incredible to Keynes's world, but hard rains are now annual events where and when it basically never rained for tens of thousands of years. In the Siberian winter, on top of the Greenland ice sheet. It would have seemed incredible, sometime in the next 50 years, possibly sooner, the Arctic will receive more precipitation in rain than snow. Centuries of climate common sense are no longer sensible, and givens are no longer given. which means that in anything other than the very short run, Keynes was wrong about the weather. It is no longer moderately uncertain. Climate change makes weather more volatile, and in fact, research shows that even with modern computing power, the predictability window for weather forecasting is shrinking as temperatures rise. Which means that if, as is often said, climate is what you expect and weather is what you get, it is increasingly the case that we can only expect what we get. And I think it's hard to understate the import of this shift, partly because it is not confined to climate. I cannot speak for everyone, obviously, but for many, including myself, developments are underway that hardly seemed imaginable or even possible 2 decades ago. Trump's permanent tantrum has created a chaotic field of generalized and arbitrary cruelty, both inside and outside the US. Democratic electorates vote for fascism. Artificial intelligence systems, even the inventors don't understand, rapidly proliferate, and the permafrost is literally on fire. What will the world be like in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time? Nobody knows. If pretty much the only thing we can say with any confidence is warmer, that's not much help. Of course, there is much that could go well between now and then. Momentum we might build, technologies and movements and people who will bring us together, but neither that kind of optimism nor the canned hope that we're constantly told we have to keep on hoping and hoping and hoping. None of that can reduce, I would say, the uncertainty or provide any clearer view of the future. Like much else in our lives, the background conditions constructed by past patterns are either definitively shifting or sure feel like they are, which, I would argue, from a human perspective, has close to the same meaning, a future at once untethered and unrefusable. When you hold it up against the past, it doesn't make much sense. It seems to me that all this and more underwrites a more than justifiable, insurmountable uncertainty that saturates the present moment, a sense that we can neither know what happens next nor trust history as our guide. Now, I realize, of course, that the world has seemed to teeter on a precipice more than once before. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, many of you will be familiar with her work, once said, writing in the shadow of Cold War nuclear buildup, about her own time, to the question, how shall we ever be able to extricate ourselves from the obvious insanity of this position, there is no answer. That still resonates today, I would argue. And maybe there's some hope in that. Maybe this time is no different than all the other times civilization, in quotes, was supposed to collapse but didn't. We might have no idea what's coming, but they didn't either. Maybe that's just the way things always seem. And yet, by every metric currently in use, global uncertainty has accelerated in the last decade, and the future is more uncertain for more people than at any time since measurement began at the end of World War II. In recent years, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, the rise of the far right across the globe, accelerating climate-driven extreme events, and all have created conditions in which the assumption of a stable horizon is no longer credible or even available in some cases. But in contrast, I would say, to the financial crisis, in this moment, but in contrast to the financial crisis, which, like virtually every other crisis of capitalism in the last 2 centuries, we were told would eventually end, it also feels like those who have always promised us that tomorrow will eventually be like today, it feels like they've let go of the wheel this time. For example, since fall 2022, the managing director of the IMF, most of you will know a lot more about her than me, Kristalina Georgieva, has been warning of what she calls a dangerous new normal of shock after shock after shock. Now, shock, I think, is a term that gives a clandestine economist away. For most of the rest of us, it is a curious word, harder and harder to fathom. How can they be shocks if they keep arriving one after the other? Who is still surprised? The whole process of expectation formation is changing. Confidence in those expectations is harder to muster, and planning, both individually and collectively, overlaps more and more with disaster preparation. I would say that the now annual 100-year flood is a very good metaphor for where we are. This is why I think we are desperately in need of new ways to think about this moment. How can we adequately confront the experience of seemingly unceasing, unlimited tumult, the deadlines that loom, the thresholds we cross, the constant shocks that no longer surprise? How do we talk about the very vague but very real sense of no idea-ness that so many feel right now about what the world will look like even 10 years down the line? And the big questions, of course, are what forms of organization can better handle the collective experience of an uncertain non-normal? What might make hope seem less like a sort of obligatory performance and more like a reasonable thing to have? Now, I would like to suggest that finance, understood in its full breadth as the capacity to mobilize and allocate large pools of liquid resources and capital, finance, not as it is but as it could be, is perhaps the single greatest means we have to address these questions. In this moment of extraordinary uncertainty, it is among the most powerful cards in our deck. Now, Keynes once said, and you may be familiar with this quote, that money is a subtle device, he said, that ties the present to the future. Finance, we might add, is its not-so-subtle twin. Indeed, as my friend Aaron Benanav has written, finance is presently how capital selects its futures. Of course, this means that it can wreak havoc, and I think it's pretty reasonable to say that for the last 5 decades or so, it has mainly been a havoc wreaker. But it need not be capital that's selecting our futures. We could use it to build the solidarity that would make it the uncertainty management tool par excellence, or at least the best available. Now, this is not, I would argue, because finance wielded in the public interest could eliminate our uncertainties. It will not and cannot. But the very project of building solidarity is itself perhaps the most important way to live together with expectational and existential uncertainties, of enabling a sense of collective agency, a sense that we will refuse to leave anyone behind. And that, I believe, is exactly what is needed for hope to feel like a sensible thing to have. It all depends on who and what finance is for. Now, what I have in mind, which seems to me is what you all, Finance Watch and all the partners, have been working on for more than 15 years. What I have in mind is, of course, very different than the just so story that the financial system is a great stabilizer in an otherwise chaotic world in which risk is rationally distributed, policy-enforced floors and ceilings contain volatility, and communities and individuals and firms can make decisions trusting that tomorrow will be like today. Now, I'm not sure that account was ever convincing, even in the midst of the so-called Great Moderation. It was certainly never true in the parts of the world where history and the global political economy has concentrated marginality, but it seems less true everywhere else now, too. But as your efforts show, I would argue, it does not have to be this way. In a modern monetary economy, which for good or ill is sort of what we're stuck with right now, finance is the single most important machine in the active construction of the future. Finance is how both public and private actors throw themselves into the making and remaking of the world, and increasingly the planet itself. It is hard to imagine any large-scale social or collective endeavor that is not fundamentally a financial question. Finance is if not the, material basis of commitment to something new, a vision of something more or different. It is the crucial first step in planet making that we are currently undertaking whether we like it or not. Now, as many have pointed out before me, the fact that so much of that planet making right now is destructive is not a function of limits on what could be financed. It is true, as Keynes famously said, that everything we can do, we can afford. The scarcity of capital is a social, not a natural phenomenon. You all know this. But Keynes's scarcity theory of capital is in some ways a second-order problem, itself a function of the fact that financial resources are concentrated in the hands of a small group whose commitments, or lack thereof, are the most powerful determinants of the kind of planet we are currently making. Hardly any of us has any say in what those commitments are. There is no place for democratic deliberation over the uses of the most powerful tool we have to address the future and its uncertainties. This is true not just of the most ornate financial instruments, of the most derived derivatives, but in the very realms of social life that might be called existential: climate, infrastructure, housing, food system, energy, health, governance itself. Now, the argument for the existing arrangement is still, after nearly 4 centuries, a fable of the V's story of private vice producing public virtue, underwritten more recently by claims that the markets solve information problems more readily than public coordination. But in the current climate, this is impossible to believe, if it ever was. Even the IMF, an institution that has for decades claimed it had all the answers to all the questions before you even asked them, now says normal is shock after shock after shock. Now, I think one of the greatest dangers of this moment, and I would say this program is already underway, is that they will try to convince many of us that this is just the way it goes, that we have to learn to live with this, that the trade-offs of leaving the current system are too great. We had an old normal, and that was normal, but now we have this new one, which is shock, shock, shock. They'll just have to get used to it. If this is what you need people to believe, then you end up, I would say, for example, with the quagmire of global climate finance like we have. It remains, despite the efforts of thousands of civil society actors and activists around the planet, it remains fundamentally half-hearted and unserious. On the one hand, its commitments remain mostly promissory. It still demands a return on investment. 3/4 of lending in climate finance, almost, depending on who you talk to, are still loans, which of course, because in negotiations, the Global South's debt is not part of the conversation, only exacerbates the problem. And this is to say nothing of the fact that the firms and countries involved are still then supporting the fossil fuel industry with trillions of dollars. On the other hand, we have climate finance innovations, but they are, in my opinion, largely parasitic, milking the climate crisis for opportunities for vampirism, shorting insurance companies, weather derivatives, catastrophe bonds. All this while some of the most powerful players in the global financial industry, at least until recently, were prancing around in their net zero suits, crowing about their money that was ready for action and they were ready to save us if we just called them over. Now, since Trump too, admittedly, many of those people have crawled back into the phone booth and taken those suits off. Many of us were dubious of the suits in the first place. None of this is capable, none of these efforts, I would argue, is capable or even really interested in confronting the monumental uncertainties that are shaping both the present and the future. Even if we cannot eliminate those uncertainties, and on the climate front, as you know, many of them are already baked in, we can refuse this new normal. We must not just get used to it. All over the world, I would say, people are mobilizing to refute the claim that there is a necessary trade-off between the things and world we value and the accelerating havoc of the way things have to be. This is an opportunity, if an admittedly daunting one. But I am convinced change is on its way, if not quite yet afoot. I don't mean to be a Pollyanna, but there is a wealth of creative ideas circulating right now, from making central banks greener and more accountable, to municipal finance stepping up where captured states refuse, to a new excitement around industrial policy and planning, even dual monetary systems and renationalization. In the part of the world that I live in, bringing indigenous people into the governance systems themselves to decide the fate of natural resources and our climate. These kinds of things are important changes. They seem as yet marginal, but they matter. And I think also what is exciting is that many of these proposals are putting uncertainty at the front of their thinking. It's not at the limits. They begin from the premise that the future is not an optimization problem. Social life is structured by multiple aims, and most of them are not presently on the table, but they will be. And figuring out how to finance those aims is not a technical, but a political problem and a political project. The goal is not merely to limit the power of capital F finance, but to take back the power that Knight said naturally belonged to them, to decide what possible futures can look like. At the very least, we can decide, I think, which ones we refuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geoff, for setting the scene in such a rich manner. We'll be taking questions from the audience in a minute. I might have a few of my own, but so please prepare your question, whether you're in the room or online. So, Geoff, I think some of what you said resonates with my views, which is if this is a world of greater uncertainty, it's also a moment where there's never been a bigger opportunity for the sort of radical change also from our perspective, right? And I think then you highlighted the role of finance as basically creating the future, controlling the future, and as you said, probably the most powerful tool to create the future we want. But I think then the question comes, how do we reclaim that power, and how do we, in a way, socialize or democratize that power of finance, right? So do you have a few thoughts in terms of, the first steps we could take towards that reclaiming of the power of finance, whether it's via the role of the state or via other means, as you said, a diversity of actors on the ground, reimagining the way it works?
Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, sorry, I can't hear me, so that was a problem. Absolutely. And I mean, there is a way in which, of course, someone like me, who mostly works in a world where a lot of the so-called big ideas can circulate without being tested, there is a way in which someone like me can pronounce that we need to socialize finance or we need to republicize the world. But I do think there are actually really exciting initiatives going on all over the world at the moment. Everything from, and some of them are just ideas at the moment, but they're clear proposals, the kinds of conversations, they're initiating the kinds of conversations I think that can really matter. So for example, the person I mentioned when I was speaking, my friend Aaron Benanav, has just recently written a couple of pieces that tries to make an argument for a whole series of national investment boards that would coordinate at the national level, he argues, but we can imagine at other spatial scales, that would coordinate the allocation of resources according to multi-criterial concerns, not only efficiency or the possibility of yield, but to bring in democratically a whole variety of concerns. That's one, I think, quite well laid out plan, but there are also other opportunities. So another example is the bank that I bank with, actually, in Vancouver, which is called Van City, it's a credit union, has a community foundation attached to it that distributes to the community with a community-led board 30% of the bank's profits every year to the local community. There is no reason every bank couldn't have a community foundation. There's no reason every bank couldn't be forced to have a community foundation with community representation on it. Anyway, I won't go on and on, but I do think there are things happening that are not just marginal, even though they sometimes seem small scale. There's no reason that we can tell right now, I would argue, how much and cultivate the whole variety of possibilities that are emerging right now.
Yeah, I think that's clear. The question remains, though, how you scale up some of these initiatives, right? And you said that there's no reason not to scale them up or to distribute these new ways of doing things more broadly, except the incumbents,
yeah,
having a huge political power and preventing that from happening, right? So I think the question from all of us is how do we get from, this vision which is quite clear and this profusion of, again, innovative ways of doing finance and the current system where that's not allowed to grow at scale, right? So that's a more practical question I think we have to address throughout the day, is that how do we build strategies to make that stunt possible? So I don't know, also from your book, if you see, again, a role for the state in certain areas or a role for more of civil society and the first steps to get there. So
I mean, those are obviously, that's the key question, of course, in some senses, is I can say all of this stuff and then we confront the power of the incumbents, as you say. And I don't have even an, or let alone the answer to that question. But I do think one of the first things is that, and I think the climate movement is, I think the climate movement is learning this, is that if, for example, this struggle around the mobilization of finance for the public good, sorry, I'm not very good at this, mobilization of public finance for the public good, is that it's not just a financial struggle. The solidarities and coalitions have to be built outside of the realm of folks that you might immediately consider working on the same issues. Certainly climate has learned this lesson, I think, quite powerfully around the world, where it's clear that the climate movement needs to articulate itself to a whole variety of movements concerned about social justice in a variety of realms. I would say the same is true of finance. I imagine that many of you are already doing work like this, so I don't want to pretend like I've just come up with this brilliant idea. But I do think that it's about articulating a vision for, and indeed a demand for, a kind of change that is not sectorally specific, if that makes sense. And I would say we have successes. They seem marginal at the moment, but we have successes.
Thank you. Do we have? Can we take questions from the audience? Yeah. So I don't know if we have microphones ready. Yes. Yes, please. If you can mention your name and affiliation. Thank
yes, hello. My name is Burçak İnal. Until very recently, I was running a unit within the main umbrella federation of the private banks of Europe, dedicated to sustainable financing. And I have two questions. One, what do you think of the role of disclosure kind of initiatives like the main tenet of the European regulatory framework to change the behavior of the private banks? And secondly, what is your view of the influence of American banks and the kind of pressures that they're subject to? I mean, speaking of uncertainty, and how bad might that influence be for the rest of the banking system in the world? I mean, obviously, I'm referring to the current administration. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a couple of other questions we can take, and then we respond all together?
My name is Gert-Jan Storm. Thank you very much for your introduction, uncertainty and risk and the new normal. Then you introduced the term shock. What I find shocking is that since a webinar held last year about climate nature scenarios and an assessment of the risks to society in financial policy, Oxford University, with the European Central Bank as a prime guest, we don't hear anything about it, which is shocking, because the assessment has been around the case study of a shock due to a breakdown of antimicrobial resistance. The UK economy is exposed to lose 6 to 12% of its GDP compared to the non-shock case towards the 2030s, which is about 5 years from today. And the logic, the methodology, is relevant to 40 economies with a similar structure, which is basically, I suppose, the OECD. The reason to mention this is that I think we all should be shocked as citizens that we don't hear anything about it except fantastic opportunities to neutralize the new normal. And I would like to have your view on, for instance, perspective for a conference like this, when we refer to the concept of One Health, human health and animal health. Would we be able to generate counterweights for the public interest and the common good together? Question mark. So thank you very much for your presentation.
We take a third question and then we respond and go back to the room. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm one of the members of Finance Watch. I wanted to know what would be your main argument for the moment when I've been asking the Commission persons, we have to direct finance. They say, no, we cannot direct finance. We know it's complete misallocation of finance for the moment, complete market failure. And of course what we see now is a lot of risks building, but would you have like a nice argument from your theory of risk and uncertainty on how to argue to their fear of saying we cannot direct finance?
All right. So this was about the direction of finance and giving a direction to financial markets, basically, which is still a total no-go or heretic notion when you discuss with policymakers in Europe. Then there was a question about climate scenarios. I think we can come back to that one. There was one about the role of disclosure and then together the role of US banks. Before I leave you the floor on disclosure, and of course there's a whole space of policy proposals in Europe. Used to be the case in the US, and I think that's more or less gone now. To have, for example, climate disclosures from corporations and then from financial institutions. I mean, if you read what we publish at Finance Watch, we do think it's important. It's the foundation for, at some point, taking into account the reality of the world and adapting to it. But I think thinking like you're Mark Carney, back in the day, that disclosure will save the day, because, I mean, he said that in 2015, 7 years after the financial crisis, that financial institutions manage risk, right, as we saw in 2008, and that when they see risk, they adapt their strategies and operations to it, again, as obvious in 2008, so that you give them the data and then they will shift the money around, which of course they don't do. So I think disclosure is part of the discussion, but to think that it's going to save the day, it was just a really powerful strategy to avoid any discussion about the directionality or purpose of finance and more ambitious policy measures. But Geoff, do you want to pick up on, I mean, the role of US banks? I'm not sure I got it, but as in the role they play in Europe as well, and or the deregulation happening in the US and how that might affect what's happening here, yeah. Development more in general in the US, yeah.
Not just banks.
Yeah. Do you want to respond to some of these questions? Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Thank you for the questions. On the issue of disclosure, I wouldn't try to jump in on Benoit's expertise. It's far greater than my own. Though I would say that I do think it's a bit of a myth that the transparency will somehow, I think the argument that transparency will solve the problem is a little bit like the market will solve the problem, because the information will enter the market and the market will react in an appropriate way. And I think that we just, as I'm sure I get the sense you also feel, that's not really working right now. I would also say, without having any particular expertise in American banks, that I do think that the direction of American political economy and cultural politics is, to state the obvious, a disaster at the moment. But I can say that in Canada it's having particularly strong kind of knock-on effects. I'm sure it's the same in other parts of the world. And I think that, interestingly enough, those impacts are not, they are happening within the financial sector. Like the Canadian economy is reeling right now in an attempt to adjust to the arbitrary whims that are enacted over and over south of the border. I'm sure it's the same for many, many other countries, and probably many other countries that are much less so-called resilient than we are. What to do about that is hard to know without getting glib, which is tempting to do. The next question, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, then there was a question about climate scenarios, but I think it was more of a comment than a question, right? Or did you have a specific question about the climate scenarios currently looked at by central banks?
The question is, when you know about it, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
One health picture.
Right.
No, I think that links to the question of Miriam. So I think, first of all, we don't know about it because, as you might know, these climate models massively underestimate the cost that climate change will create. So it's still very reassuring. Most of them are reassuring. So policymakers look at them and think, we're going to be okay. We can manage this. A few percentage points of GDP going down. But so we first need to fix these scenarios. But then you're right. Then even when we fix them and we see the real cost, you would still need then a lot of political courage and creativity to start addressing the size of the problem. And I think, again, it goes to Miriam's question about giving a direction to finance in different ways, which really needs to, as you explained in your introductory keynote, which really needs to be the ultimate aim we have. So now you can do that in different ways. You can claim back some of the financial means for the public sector, which then needs to have an ambitious, project for society and industrial strategy, which then private markets would follow. Or you can specifically direct private capital with certain political tools. But this is, I think, indeed, as Miriam alluded to, the discussion we really need to have. I want to move on to capture more questions. So maybe some online and then some in the room. Yes, please.
Yes, hello. My name's James Cantor from the media EU Scream. Thank you, Geoff, for your very interesting talk. You mentioned, among other things, fascism, the rise of very unpredictable leaders like Donald Trump. You also mentioned climate and AI as factors in what I think you described as the uncertain new normal. I wondered if we should add to that the idea of war. And I say that specifically from perhaps a Brussels perspective, because we now see that rearmament has become in itself an argument for a kind of reboosting of Europe's economies. This is the idea that through rearmament and defense spending, we can perhaps turn the clock back to a previous era of prosperity. How does that factor into perhaps some of your thinking about the uncertain new normal? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Question over there.
Hi, Tom Jess from the Club of Rome. Thanks, Geoff, for your presentation. I have a question about mindset shift within the financial system and the actors and institutions. I very much agree with the way you describe the role of the financial actors, institutions, in kind of actively constructing the future. But I think current actors and institutions very much see their role as passive and following markets and not getting involved in the direction of the economy. So how do we shift? Any thoughts on that shift to be able to kind of see your vision?
Thank you. And should we take a few words from online questions? Well, we do that later. Do you want to pick up on the first question, Geoff, on the war and
Sure.
the weights? Yeah.
Sure, war. I'm happy to talk about war. I mean, it's interesting, James, that you raise it. It's clear to me, if my sense is at all correct, that this is much more on people's minds here on this side of the Atlantic than it is on my side of the Atlantic. But it absolutely makes perfect sense, and it fits exactly in the sort of array of concerns, I think, that are weighing people down. I mean, Gaza itself is, of course, creating similar destabilizations and also political rage, around the world. So we have the prospect of a European war, perhaps. We have Gaza. We have all of these other things going on. And I do think it builds, again, to articulate the issues across themselves. I think what it does is it builds a kind of like inability to form expectations in the economic language that where the poly crisis is actually a poly crisis in the sense that knowing where one ends and the other begins, each crisis is impossible to know. And they become a kind of morass. And I think it feels very gravity-defying for many, many, many regular citizens as to how to understand even their planning for the future in a way that doesn't feel a bit like, as I said, disaster preparation. I mean, as a sort of an interesting, I think, aside, as a person who lives in North America and is exposed occasionally to American media, one of the things that's very interesting that I've noticed recently is the number of television ads for survivalist goods on North American television is extraordinary. And a company called 4 Patriots, 4 the number, Patriots, has exploded in popularity, and it advertises during NFL football games for generators, powdered food, water tanks. Like, this is mainstreaming apocalypticism that, in this case, has a sort of far-right tinge, but there is a variation of this, I think, that is much more widely shared. And this is the kind of uncertainty that I'm interested in, and I would certainly add the prospect of any kind of war. Civil war in the U.S. is still a discussion. Whether or not it's possible, I have no idea. And then the other question was about the way that most people feel like they're just playing along and they're not actively constructing a future, they're just participating. I actually think that's a good metaphor for much of our political activity right now, not just in the world of finance. And I think part of what is perhaps possible here, and maybe it's a first step toward the republicization, if we want to call it that, of the power of finance, is a political movement that can in some ways tie the futures towards which we are presently heading to the action of the producers of that future in this moment. So in some ways, we don't need to convince finance that they're constructing the future. We need to convince the rest of us that finance is constructing the future. Because everyone's looking at that future saying, that's not the future that I was aiming for. And in some ways, we need to kind of articulate a politics that frames the decisions as being made even by the folks who disavow the very nature of those decisions themselves. Now, I do think this actually can happen, and I think there are examples of other realms in which this political move has been made, where people are held to account for stuff that they claim to not be responsible for. I'm not so sure how to do that in anything more than a kind of like overall struggle, political movement, mobilization kind of way. But I do think that, I think you're absolutely right. I think most people believe they're following the markets, they're not making them. And that is probably individually true, but collectively not true, in much the way, you know, that so many of these other problems get framed as the product of a series of unintended effects.
Thank you. Yes, over there, yeah, 3 questions, 4, so Christoph.
Deepa Driver, Vice Chair of the Board of Finance Watch. Geoff, I was just listening to you. Thank you for those very interesting and a lot of food for thought there. And I was wondering whether the continuum after disclosure and transparency is for us together to understand that once you have disclosure and transparency and people can see, for example, a live stream genocide, the big thing that people want is power. And our job today, I think, is partly to reclaim that power. And we reclaim that power by allowing people to make sense of things. And that's what Trump does so well, right? Because he's able to do that. And I think what I wondered if you might comment on is the ways in which we reclaim that narrative and reclaim the power, or even claim it for the first time.
Thanks a lot, Deepa. Yeah, over there. And then.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ilaria. I work at UNCTAD, the UN. Hi, so many faces I know here. No, I noticed. UN Trade Conference on Trade and Development. My question is on the broader, at the broader level, because we are talking, and I think many of the people in this room agree, about how we need to shape the current system that we have, how the global international financial architecture is not fit for purpose and for the challenges of this century. And we are seeing a proliferation of initiatives that goes into that direction. And also the moderator was saying that there is a movement, that there is broader consensus for a change. But at the same time, all these initiatives, they have different priorities. They're going to focus on, I don't know, debt vulnerabilities, on cost of capital, on Bretton Woods institutions, governance, and so on. So there are many different priorities going in different directions. And I'm also afraid that sometimes that goes more into the direction of political feasibility rather than what is necessary at this moment. So my question is, what do you see as priorities right now and what is not maybe the low-hanging fruit, but what do you think could happen in the short term? What are the priorities in the long term, and how to bridge this gap between what is really needed and the political feasibility of that? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it would take a full day to respond to these questions, but Seb, yeah. And then over there, yeah. And then we'll take responses. Yes, and then we'll start wrapping up.
Thank you very much. I'm Sebastian Mang, working for the New Economics Foundation. I guess thinking about shocks, shocks turn into crisis at some point, and Finance Watch was obviously created in part to check for the next crisis and respond to the next crisis and make sure that it doesn't happen again. I wonder whether you've thought about what happens when shocks turn into crisis, and what you think how people will respond. And then as a second question, which could be obviously positive and could be negative, and then as a second question, how do we as progressives make sure that it becomes a moment for systemic change? Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Then last question over there.
Well, I'd like to chime in. I'm a games designer and I work in the media. And it's kind of the elephant in the room, maybe. But do you think that our problems are systemic, caused by the system, maybe, caused by the market, caused by the competition? Or do you think it's more a case of bad actors and maybe more in the direction of tweaking what we're busy with?
Thank you. Yeah, so there was a question about, you know, moving from disclosure to power and how we reclaim that power, and the sense that giving a sense that we understand what's going on and can interpret the future can go a long way and reclaim that power, and how do we do that? There was a question about political feasibility, short-term priorities versus long-term priorities. Then the question about shocks turn into crises and us using crises as a moment to push for radical change. And then the last one about, yeah, is it bad actors and a few tweaks will go, or is it a more systemic transformation we need? All in 3 or 4 minutes. Just give it.
In some ways, it's good to have a limit because it prevents me from just spinning off into orbit. Thank you very much for all the questions. And I will admit to being unable to probably answer in any kind of adequate way all of them. But I do think, as we were talking about last night at dinner, to return to the first comment about power, I think you're right. I mean, I think the making sense part is an enormous part of the task right now, a huge project that we have. And as we were saying last night, I would argue that, at least in North America, which is the part of the world I know the best, we are in a situation where the folks that find Trump or Trump-like characters appealing are folks who feel like their experiences of the world are written off as delusions, as if they don't understand what's going on around them, as if the technocrats or the folks like me and Benoit who are explaining the world to them, it doesn't match their own experience in any way whatsoever. And so they're saying to themselves, how can it be that my life is not reflected in the so-called truths that are handed down? And I would say, this is obviously a strategic question that I am in no way better off answering than any of you, but we need to do this on the left. That, like, the populist dimension of this needn't be to debase the conversation. It can be about articulating power, perhaps in some ways, to return back to this question about who is making the future, to talk about who is actually making the future. So, and perhaps that is I'm not sure of the venues or the arenas in which this needs to happen first, but I do think you're pointing to the kinds of conversations that we need to initiate. And that will actually require us to take seriously points of view that, for the most part, we think are loony, which is a hard first step, but I think it's necessary at the moment. To address the question of priorities, perhaps we should have lunch together. I don't have, off the top of my head, a great answer. I do think your distinction between the longer and shorter term priorities is an important one. The only thing I worry about in that distinction is that the long-term ones are constantly deferred, and I think we find that happening right now, is that we name longer-term goals, but because we've busied ourselves with the shorter-term goals, this is certainly true in the realm of climate, that the larger-term goals become a constant process of deferral. COP, I think, is a very good example of this, again, despite the efforts of many who do. So it would be a really fascinating thing to talk about. Yes, absolutely, it's structural. I don't believe markets are ever going to solve this problem. I think that they can help us fudge around the edges, but this is not. We're not going to solve the climate problem, for example, nor all of the other ones, with better operating, better functioning markets. I would totally agree, assuming that's what you think. Yeah. And there was one other question, I apologize.
No, it was about using the crisis as an opportunity. Yeah.
So I actually think I mean, perhaps you're way ahead of me on this, but I think you're right. I think you're really onto something, because the naming of the crisis is an extraordinary power, right? The shock, whatever you want to call it, which does actually sound quite weird to non-economists. But when the shock becomes a crisis, as you say, and we name the crisis as, perhaps we could define the crisis as something like a condition in which that can no longer be ignored, let's say, or something like that. I'm not sure how to define a crisis. But the power to name the crisis, and also the power to tell us when it's over, are extraordinarily important political powers, not technical ones. And I think we can capture those. For example, again, I keep returning to the example of climate, but I do think there's a way in which the struggle in the climate movement is often about how to name the problem. Do we call it a crisis? Do we call it a challenge? Do we call it a this? And I actually think those matter in the sense of, because they both mobilize people politically in different ways, but they also kind of narrate
a story that we find ourselves in. And the power of naming the crisis is an extraordinary one, and right now it's in the hands of, for the most part, folks we wish it weren't.
Just a quick one from my side, and then we'll wrap up, and we'll have a word from Axel. I think, so in a nutshell, I think the bad actors versus the system, I mean, it's a reality that some, we would call bad actors, control the system, right? So it's system change, but it's not like there are no names and no faces, right? So the oligarchs funding and supporting MAGA, they have a plan. They have a long-term plan. They give a direction to the whole financial system. And right now, financial markets are happy with that, right? You didn't see market collapses despite Trump's craziness because they think it's not that crazy. I think it links to the question of leadership and ambition and reassuring people there is a plan. Financial markets see there is a plan over there. And the plan will go along their interests. So I think that links also to the question of short-term, long-term. These people do that. I would argue the other side, again, naming MAGA is easy, but I think unfortunately these movements are blooming outside of the US, also because they want that consciously to extend beyond of the US. They do wargaming. They look into the future. They have their own very clear vision of where they want to go, and we don't, to be honest. We do not. We don't have a clear vision of where we want to go. We don't know where we headed. Yeah, it's going to be worse. Yeah, shocks. But we don't wargame the different ways it goes, as intelligence agencies do, as corporations do, and these very large asset managers. So I think responding to that question of what is the long-term vision we have, how do we get there in the long term, and short-term priorities is really what we should be working on. So I think thanks for that question. And then the crises, when we have that plan, must be understood as opportunities to advance our agenda in massively quick ways. I mean, it's not going to be done with the first crisis, but and in that sense, one thing I can commit to is that Finance Watch will be looking at a project to prepare for the next financial crisis. So of course, we all want to avoid it. There's a number of measures. You also want to prepare for it because, unfortunately, it's quite likely it will happen at some day. As an opportunity, of course, to push for the deep financial reforms we need, but also the broader economic system change paradigm that we will need. So, but I mean, what we just outlined here is the plan for discussions for the whole day. Axel, I think you want to have a quick message, but first, Geoff, thanks a lot for your insights. This was really, really helpful to set the scene. So, round of applause. Yeah, thank you.
First of all, thank you very much, Geoff and Benoit, for this wonderful fireside chat and all the really great questions we had in the audience. I just wanted to say, hi, I'm Excel. I'm coordinating the forum on behalf of Finance Watch. So we'll have in the coffee break and during the other breaks, we'll have Désorceler la Finance, which is an art and activist collective that has an activity in the back. So if you do want to kind of get your hands dirty, you can go hang out with them. And other than that, just enjoy your break. Just know that after that, we will have the parallel sessions and the panels. It will be a first come, first serve for the parallel sessions, and we have some wonderful ones on narratives as well. What kind of words do we use to define the problems today? That will be very interesting. So you can check out the program. Thank you. Have a good break.